Good morning, and can I welcome you to this 60-minute session on fire safety. I'll be doing enough. My name's Taranczuk, and I'm going to be chairing this motley mob this morning. Can I introduce? I'm with Stephanie and Kabbe and Yusuf. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and then we'll just have a quick chat about stuff generally as people are joining us. I can see that's happening at the moment. So, Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, so I'm Stephanie Lloyd-Foxe, Head of Building Safety and Compliance at Magna Housing, and also Vice Chair of the National Housing Maintenance Forum.
Kabbe.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Kabbe Njie. I'm the current Head of Fire Safety at RBKC, former LFB Fire Engineer and Fire Safety Inspecting Officer. Currently responsible for all things fire safety and indeed building safety at RBKC.
Thanks, Kabbe. And Yusuf.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yusuf Mohammed. I'm the Chief Design Officer at Plumis. I have an engineering background. I'm just passionate about solving problems with technology.
That's brilliant. Now, people I see are continuing to join us, and whilst they join us, let me just remind people that we've got no fire alarms planned for this morning, not in my house anyway, so you're on your own. And I just said to my colleagues, I haven't got any deliveries planned this morning either, but if somebody does knock on the door, I should be obliged to leave you lot talking and go and answer it, because that's the polite thing to do. You're responsible for your own refreshments. I've got my coffee sorted out in a very big, posh, Port Meriam mug bought by Mrs. T many years ago. So I'm going to get on and slurp on that as we discuss. And I think as we were advertised at 11 o'clock, it would be rude not to kick off because we've only got 60 minutes. So what I'd like to do, and this is, remember colleagues, this is a conversation in which the chat box is there for you to ask questions. Those questions will then make their way to me during the course of the 60 minutes. If we don't manage to answer them all during the course of the 60 minutes, we'll make sure that we get the answers to you afterwards. And the other bit of this really is about sharing. I believe that there's only one way to learn, and that is to share good and bad practices. And if you've got something that's going on in your own organisation that is good and you'd think other people should know about it, perhaps you could put it in the box, give us a link to share so that when we do a roundup email to everybody, we can share that information and point others to what it is you'd like to shout about, because the more people who shout the good stuff, the better it will be for everyone. So to kick off then, fire risk assessments have been around since since October 2006, although for many organisations they didn't become very fashionable until after the Lakenhall House fire. And the whole discussion about the new regulations is about how we should share the information with residents from the risk assessment. So Stephanie, do you want to kind of pick up on what you're doing at Magna and what you picked up from other people? Because I know you had the National Housing Maintenance Forum session in January as well. What you've picked up, what other people are doing as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real mixed bag out there. I think generally most people are evolving their approach at the moment currently, and considering, and I think some of the considerations that we need to think about are, you know, the target audience of the fire risk assessment information, whether it's the right thing to share a very long and often complex document with everybody in its unedited format, I think is a debate that is raging on currently. At Magna, what we're proposing to do is actually, and we're developing a portal where we share not only information on fire safety, but all aspects of compliance relevant both to the block and to the individual property within that block as well. So that is currently a work in progress. I know some people do put them up in notice boards in common parts. Some people will just share the action plan as a result of that, but I think we need to be very careful about what that actually said without a degree of interpretation. Personally, I think a better way might be actually going through that risk assessment, drawing out those elements that impact residents that they might be able to have an influence on. So, for example, you know, keep it clear, any housekeeping issues, if there's major work programs planned off of the back of risks that have been identified as part of the fire risk assessment. Those are all very relevant. People can see the clear impact of that risk and then what the mitigation measure is being done to resolve that. I think if we just start sending out huge documents without any explanation, they're very technical, some of them, And I think it also depends on the quality of the fire risk assessment that we're receiving back as well. And hopefully most people have evolved their approach to that now and are fairly satisfied that they've got a robust and sufficient risk assessment. But given the level of depth and technical information in there, I think a lot of people, if you just sent the full document, are not going to read it. And those that perhaps do read it are likely to be quite worried about the contents in there. So I think that as landlords, it's our duty really to interpret that and present that information in a format that is appropriate for the demographic that is going to be receiving that information. So yeah, and I mean, ideally, you'd want to get to a point, wouldn't you, where you were tailoring that for each block or each individual person, because they're going to have different needs as well. So, for example, you know, in a sheltered block, the most appropriate way might be that you have a weekly coffee morning and somebody pops along from the building safety team or the fire safety team and says, look, you know, we've had this assessment. There's a few things here that we're going to be doing. This is what it is. And then maybe follow that up with a notice somewhere that explains that. For other blocks, that might not be relevant at all. And you might want to summarise something, or even have that self-serve portal that we're looking to move towards as well. So I think it's very much a work in progress, and these are the kind of issues that I think organisations are grappling with at the moment. What is the best way to present that information?
Thank you. Kabbe, what's happening at Kensington, Chelsea, and perhaps what did you do at Newham as well? This would be relevant.
Yeah, and Enfield, I suppose. It's all relevant. I suppose I'm looking at it through a particular lens, and all of the points that Stephanie makes there, I would agree with 100%. You know, I've faced similar issues in every local authority that I've been to, in terms of what Stephanie's outlining, in terms of those challenges. But I think what's becoming quite clear is that there's quite a divergent group of people, seemingly all at the moment doing things slightly differently. So, you know, we are looking at a portal access phenomena here, if you like, at RBKC. Similar conversations were had at Newham, and similar conversations were definitely had at Enfield in that regard, in the context of building safety. And I understand that there is an expectation that we provide the residents of these buildings with ready and easy access to, you know, building safety and fire safety information. The extent and scope of that information, we're still figuring out. A lot of it is going to be based, you know, upon the safety case reports, I imagine, that we're all sort of compiling ahead of April, when we have to start engaging with the regulator. But it will be developed over time, I think. There are other things to consider as well, in terms of how FRAs are being delivered at the moment. You know, we do have some housing providers who are, you know, outsourcing FRAs, some with better success than others, because once you outsource, you've then got to contract manage, and you lose a little bit of the control in terms of the quality of the output of the FRA. But if you have an in-house FRA service, well, then again, you have a bit more control over the quality, the competence of the assessors, all of those things, anomalies that we find on FRAs that are not necessarily findings or don't constitute actions, but suddenly appear on an FRA. Somebody unqualified reads it and thinks it's something that has to happen sometimes. This, you know, we're trying to unpick a lot of this stuff now. So I think a lot of what we're going to do will have to be developed over time. I think what is fairly consistent is that we have to be transparent. And, you know, the residents that we are placing in these buildings, we're required to make the building safe, first of all. Yes, absolutely. But somehow we're going to have to measure how we make the people in the building feel safe, because I think that, again, was an expectation of lots of the conversations and working groups that went before us. And so I'm starting to talk to people about perhaps some new working groups where we can try and figure out, well, how do we all now come together and practically apply all of this, you know, sometimes completing and contradictory statute, actually. But I think time is what's going to be needed here. I think what will be useful for residents, rather than issuing them with a report, no matter how redacted or summarized the report is from a technical perspective, perhaps, as has been discussed many times previously, we need to just give them a RAG rating. Your building is green because all of these things have been done. or your building is amber because we're about to do this. We don't want the red one, obviously, because that has other ramifications and connotations. But time, discussion, collaboration, sharing and defining best practice. I think that's what we're all here trying to do. But we haven't had a great deal of guidance from the policymakers yet. We're still waiting for that, but we've also been told not to wait. So collectively, I think we can have a very, very good stab. And I think the point that Jan made at the beginning of sharing, I'm quite happy to share everything that I've ever learned in this fire game. I'd like the same energy back from the rest of the community because in partnership is the only way I think that we're going to actually figure this stuff out. And up until this point, yeah, we just haven't had the leadership, I don't think, from the policymakers that I think we were expecting.
Okay, that's an interesting point, but can I just make this point that I actually don't think we need policymakers to tell us how to talk to residents.
No, I agree. I agree.
And
that's exactly what I'm saying. We don't need that. We know how to do it, and this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to define best endeavours, best practice, resident engagement. We're trying to do that. We absolutely don't need policymakers for that. It would be nice to have some guidance from the policymakers with regards to how what we're all trying to do somewhat separately will fit into the conversation that we're all going to go and have somewhat separately with the regulator, for example. Yeah, so I'm not suggesting that we need policymakers to tell us how to do what we're doing currently, because we're all doing it. I'm just saying that there might need to be a little bit more cohesion and a bit more joint up thinking with regards to everybody's got their own strategies now. That there are probably hundreds or thousands of resident engagement strategies across the nation now. And we now need to figure out, well, which one or how does the regulator mark or score those strategies? That's all.
Okay.
That's all
I think that point's well made. I just wonder whether prior to the recent draft of legislation, fire risk assessments were being procured, and then people were being sent off with flip charts and tablets to go off to mark a building and make the relevant comments about it. And it just seems to me that if we've got the aim to be able to, if the aim of the fire risk assessments is to share the information in the risk assessment to the people who live in the building, would it be a good idea then to procure the risk assessment and the risk assessor in the way that, in a specific way, which actually says, well, before you go anywhere near the building, we as the client are going to give you all the information about service records and inspection records and so on. So you're not going to put them down as a potential risk because you haven't seen them, ticking the box number one.
Yeah.
Number two, there would be merit, I think, in saying to a block to say, well, actually, the risk assessor is going to attend on a particular date,
potentially,
and come out and talk, come out and talk to the risk assessor when he or she turns up, so that we've got that initial discussion. So that Stephanie's point about the sheltered block, it's always easier to do in a sheltered block because there's generally a common room and there'll be stuff done together. But that kind of that closing of the circle of saying to people, we're coming on a particular day, the risk assessor will have the basic information and we'll share with you during the course of the assessment, so that at the end of it, it's more green than amber, and that has to form part of the resident engagement strategy in the first place, I would have thought.
I agree. I mean, we're starting a few pilots in RBKC in that regard, in sheltered and high risk blocks. Somebody much more creative and much cleverer than I came up with the concept of a chippy and a chat in regards to building safety, right? Now, the title is amusing. Absolutely. I like chips and I like to chat, so I'll be going. But it was a really useful tool, I think, and a really useful way of engaging with people in their home. We don't have common rooms generally in purpose-built blocks of flats, so it makes it a bit difficult to do things like that in those spaces. But where you've got a sheltered or specialized block with a lounge or a common place or a common area or a library, or a den, it's quite easy to have these types of community events. So we're in the planning stage. We had intended to start those just before Christmas, but due to some other operational issues that we were dealing with, we had to push it back. but the guys and girls are busily beavering away at the office at the moment, trying to get that ready for April. So absolutely, might be something that, you know, Yusuf, yourself, Stephanie, perhaps if you wanted to come and have a look, I don't know. But anybody that's interested in having a look at what we're trying to do, just come and have a look. You know, we'll take any criticism, good or bad, as long as it's constructive. But yeah, that's what we're trying to do. So I'll make you right, Jan.
That's good. No, I think anything involving housing has got to involve food, definitely. And in Ealing, when I did it for staff, we called it at lunchtime. We called it chew and do. So it's a similar kind of thing, right? So listen, let's park fire risk assessments for the minute. I suspect we may well come back to them. And one of the questions that came up over the last couple of weeks after we'd advertised the event was about how do we audit work? How do we audit the work that's been done to ensure that the work has been done correctly, that compliance has been, how do we audit to ensure compliance in the work that's been completed? Stephanie, how do you do that at Magna? Have you got some sort of audit process, inspection process?
Yes, yeah, we do. So, I mean, it depends what it is. But for example, if there's any physical work being carried out to a block, there is a number of inspections that will take place, and that's something that we've ramped up on, actually, because I think it's quite easy to rely on somebody's alleged competence by way of you know, certification, or they belong to this scheme and they give you a piece of paper at the end of it and you think, oh, that's brilliant. That's definitely compliant because that's been signed off by somebody else. But the reality, and learning through kind of bitter experience, and certainly talking to other NHMF members as well, similar experiences, is that actually doesn't demonstrate compliance at all, even if they are part of a registered trade body. So that inspection regime is incredibly important. I think it will depend on the complexity of the work, the duration of work, and the type of work as to what your inspection regime looks like. But certainly there needs to be you know, a number of inspections if it's a complex piece of work, and it's likely to be covered up. So, you know, compartmentation works or anything kind of fairly major, you know, external works, things like that. So you would probably look to identify where those key points are, your milestones in your project, and then arrange to have those inspections carried out at that stage. I mean, one major kind of cladding remediation program that we carried out, we actually had, you know, hold points built into the program where the contractor wasn't allowed to progress any further until everybody, the engineer, us, you know, then you know, building control, like whoever needed to be there was there. We then get signed off and say, right, okay, and that's the next stage, and we built that into the program. If you're looking at sort of slightly less involved work, and I think at least you know, a sample check at the very least. So, you know, if it's a fire door replacement program, but you're going to want to see that they're installing proper packing behind the doors, aren't you? That you've got that everything's closed off as it should be. You haven't got any gaps that are just going to be covered up with architrave. So I think it does depend on the type of work, but it's absolutely essential in my view that you do carry out those inspections and are not just relying on that organisation and their credentials, because you know, we're only as good as our kind of weakest member or that link, aren't we? So if you know, if you don't want that Friday afternoon job from the apprentice that isn't being supervised by somebody, and the reality is that happens, doesn't it? So we do need, I think we have a duty, a responsibility to check that work is being carried out as well.
And thanks, Steph. Kabbe?
Yeah, again, I couldn't agree more. So some of the checking, for example, one of the things that sort of popped up quite quickly after I came here to RBKC was around doors and door checking. There's a number of different layers of assurance here. One of the ones here is, I believe RBKC were one of the first local authorities to become BAFE accredited, BAFE SBO 205, in terms of validating FRAs. So there's a process internally whereby some of our surveyors take a sample of the FRAs that are conducted by another contractor and they peer review and validate them, which I think is really useful actually in the first instance. The second bit about accreditations, Stephanie's absolutely right, I think, again, because the accreditation is not the measure of the person that pitches up to do the work. It just is not. You know, you can have accreditations that cover groups of people, and you have a supervisor. The supervisor or the company gets accredited, the operatives go off and do the work. But if the supervisor isn't checking the work, well, what's the point of the accreditation? And so there's lots to consider. It's not just the accreditation or the qualification or the training course that the person that's gone on where we should be really measuring the real value. I think it again comes back to this new definition of competence. That's what we should be focusing on, making sure that whoever's doing any of the work that we're asking them to do for whatever reason, where it has life safety or building safety or resident safety implications or connotations, I think we must start holding ourselves to an enhanced duty to make sure that those people know what they're doing. And we found something that we've been discussing ever since when we were looking to procure our fire door checking partner or contractor. We were looking at Regulation 10 in particular, and Regulation 10 didn't mention competence at all. Much like the fire safety order never mentioned the competence of a fire risk assessor. It was never a requirement, a complete oversight that we've only just kind of started to deal with 17 years later. But there's lots of conversation around making sure everybody's competent, but seemingly with these flat entrance door checks, there's a suggestion based particularly on the guidance that came out not long ago that says anybody can do the door checks. It says, I think the wording, if I can find it, it says something along the lines of, it is expected that the responsible person or their staff should, with simple instruction, be able to carry out the checks. There's no expectation that the person currently, based on what we've got at the moment, is competent, which again doesn't seem to align with all of the other conversations that we're having around competence. How can we have an incompetent person come and check something that's risk critical? It's a fire door. It's a risk critical component in any fire strategy. How can we have an incompetent person come and check that with no methodology and then make recommendations to a so-called competent person to fix that door? From an engineering perspective, it's mind-boggling. It's really.
Right. So can I interrupt you, because it's the first time you and I have disagreed. I think you're wrong.
Let's talk it through. I have no problem being wrong, as you know.
Well, it's just that I think the whole point about checking doors is that it's checking doors. The testing of the door and the competence of the door was originally around its installation, and then will have been around how it was assessed by the fire risk assessor. I think anybody, including a homeowner, is able to check whether their door closes and whether it fits the hole that's there.
I agree.
I think that's really the only thing that people are being asked to do, because that up until now has been the main thing that has caused fire to spread past the original compartment. I think the whole discussion around competence around its installation and its maintenance, I think, is part of that, is part of a wider conversation. But if we were looking for competence at the very beginning to inspect every door, we'd have exactly the problem we'd have that we were talking earlier on with Stephanie before we came online, which is in fact the world is short of people who are competent to inspect external walls, and therefore you have to make a judgment about what is or isn't there. The other issue, sorry, just to move swiftly a bit on, because Chris Waterman has come in with a question which is around how does a fire risk assessor get experience? And I think it ties back to this whole issue, which hasn't been tackled by anybody, which is where we are going to find the right people to do the right things to maintain a level of safety right the way through the process.
Well, I agree with you. I'm not suggesting that we can't check them. We can check doors. Absolutely, we can. I'm not saying that. I'm just suggesting that we're talking about lots of technical matters, lots of statutory and regulatory matters. There's has been post-Grenfell a justified focus on ensuring that people are competent to do the work that they've been engaged to do. All I'm suggesting is that here at RBKC, for example, there is a stated aim that we hold ourselves to an enhanced duty. So therefore, this door check that doesn't have to be done by a competent person, we've got a competent person to do it because it gives us additional assurance.
Right.
That's all.
Okay. No.
That's all I'm suggesting. So
I think they're two separate programs of work. Actually, I think your actual door inspections by a competent person is one work program that runs sort of separate to that, and then I think that maybe the quarterly checks are done by your caretaking staff or your housing staff or whatever. But you have two separate programs for that.
They are two separate programs. We could have got the contractors to do them, but there's a massive piece of training that needs to be done there. Not ready yet. Not ready yet. Fire Safety England regs went live a couple of weeks ago, so we couldn't do that. So we've taken a slightly different approach, and we've said, okay, we have our FRA contract, we have our FRA checking contract. We'll also have a contract or a partner who will do our door checks for us rather than us being accused of marking our own homework, because that has been a criticism placed here at RBKC that others may not have to deal with. I'm just talking about it from our current perspective. So you're absolutely right. They are separate completely. They all are. But that's how it was set up here. And I've got no problem with it. It was how I found it. And actually now thinking about it, I think it works quite well. But it might not be for everybody. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, no, Yusuf, you come in because I was going to bring you in anyway. So jump in because you've been quiet so far.
Well, I mean, I think just this conversation has highlighted the fact that it's not as easy as just ticking a box. There are this is a complicated problem with nuances. Dependent on the type of building, how much management availability you have. And I would say at a time where the sort of trust in manufacturers and installers, probably one of the lowest I've seen within the industry, everyone's got to be doing their homework as to understand and to dive into the processes that we have to kind of protect us. So I think there's a conversation which has to happen, which is ongoing. It's about sharing information. It's making sure everybody is comfortable and on the same page, and in sort of leaning into the golden thread so that there is as much information that's available to everybody within that process, so we can all be checking. I kind of feel also trying to get a benchmark or consensus among your peers, so you're understanding what they're doing and vice versa, also helps us kind of come to that kind of that happy place, that medium.
And I think that's a good point. And I think, can I just kind of move slightly away from that door inspection regime to what goes on behind the front door, and the issue that we're going to have very soon, which will be the result of the consultation around emergency evacuation, that whole issue. But the fact that person-centered fire risk assessments are already or should already be in place, and people should already be doing them. The issue really is, we're back to what is the minimum. How can we provide extra support to those people doing those person-centered fire risk assessments to make them aware about how people can be made safe as a result of having that conversation? Yusuf, do you want to come in? On that, because that I think is directly linked to the clever Plumis system.
Yeah, well, I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that a lot of our guidance, a lot of the things which we have in place are looking back at historical best practice. And I think historical best practice has a place in terms of solving solutions, but the RFSO explicitly mentions adapting to technical progress and acknowledges that our fire safety risks are evolving at quite a rate, and the types of situations which we need solutions for, there's all sorts of different things. So this is one of the things that we're focused on. We're trying to find the gaps in the technology and come up with solutions that address some of those risks. So the benchmark, or I guess one of the factors which we've really considered is that the water supply is one of the most significant factors when it comes to retrofitting of solutions. So we've come up with a solution that can be easily installed on a case-by-case basis. So you're not just thinking about sort of a blanket wide solution for a new build. You perhaps identified a risk and you're looking to address that.
I think that's right, and I think that the more we have these conversations and the more we share information about what's available, because is really important. Because at the minute there is a danger that people are scared of doing a person-centered fire risk assessment because they're worried about when they get to the end of it, they don't know necessarily what to do. And I think the training within your own organisation, our organisations, has to be relevant to that. How are you coping with that in Magna, Stephanie? I'll keep coming back to the National Housing Maintenance Forum because I think the general information's there, and I think we also ought to mention the National Social Housing Fire Strategy Group that we're both involved in, which has a catchy title, but we'll come back to that in a minute. So how do we help people do person-centered fire risk assessments?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing is I think there's a lot of people actually not doing them and not capturing the people that actually need to have them done, and I think that's the first step really. Have you got the data on those residents, and have you got that information? Have you built up a relationship where you know those people that are likely to be more at risk? So I think that's the first challenge, and often some of those people will be the ones that are least likely to want to engage with you on occasion as well. So I think with physical disability sometimes it's a little bit easier, but there's also the mental health issues as well that might affect someone's capacity to act in the event of an emergency. So I think these are all really important things that we need to capture information on. It's then about who does that person-centered fire risk assessment, and the way that I see that is really that's just identifying those risks, and I think with appropriate training, what we've done is actually skilled up our sheltered housing teams and our housing officers who have that direct relationship with our customers on a more day-to-day basis. They're more likely to be trusted by them, and they will go in and work through a form, really just talking and identifying those risks. At the end of that, then, if there is something that has been identified where either there is a significantly higher level of risk because of the circumstances that exist within that home, or that person is identified as being more at risk, that's the point then I think we need to engage with more specialist help. So we're not expecting them to go any further than flagging up those risks. Then on a very, very much case-by-case basis, right, what is the most appropriate course of action here? And it might be that we've identified a load of hazards and we engage with the fire service and they do a safe and well visit, and maybe we put in some additional measures, and that might be additional detection. It might be something that's sort of specific to them. If they've got hearing impairments, it might be visual alarms or vibrating pillows, things like that. So depending on what it is, if we're going beyond that then, and we've got somebody that is physically unable or perhaps mentally unable to move away from the source of a fire, then I think we've got all sorts of options there in terms of suppression, early detection, thinking about what is the evacuation plan. Do they live with somebody? Do they live alone? What would they be doing? But that is very much a two-way conversation as well, because I think people, and this is the message we're sort of constantly trying to get out, isn't it? It's like, what would you do in the event of a fire? Just in your own, you have a think about that. Instead of us just saying, right, this is what you should do, it's like, what would you do? And it's starting that conversation, because often people haven't really considered that. It's something that doesn't happen that often, but obviously when it does, the consequences are quite catastrophic. And I think, one thing I've been reflecting on is we've done quite a lot of data reconciliation to ensure that all of our smoke detection is up to date, as I'm sure everyone has, ahead of the regulations. But the amount of people that don't test their smoke detection, for example, on a regular basis, and there's been national campaigns about that for years. The fire service is on every fire station, it's on the side of fire engines. There's been televised campaigns. It goes in all of our resident newsletters, in every letter that we send out to people about safety. But still, that message isn't getting through. So I think if we can't get that message out, we need to be really think quite carefully, don't we, about how we deliver some of that messaging to our customers to get that engagement. So it really is sort of getting them to start thinking about what do you need? How are you going to? Have you even thought about it? actually, should the worst happen, what can we do to then help you, in that situation? And some of that will be something like, sprinklers or suppression systems or early detection. And some of that might be, right, well, okay, how do we then evacuate in the event of an emergency? And that solution will be very, very case specific.
Absolutely. Now, listen, whilst you've been talking, some people have been tippity-tappeting on their machines with great energy. Lucy Cowell, thank you, Lucy. Do you think that as professionals in the industry, we need to start taking responsibility and ensuring we're doing the right thing? As Yusuf said, doing our own homework to ensure compliance. Kabbe, do you want to come back to Lucy on that one, and then I'll come back to Steph?
Yeah, I think, well, the accountability discussion, we grown-ups, generally speaking, we do try and hold ourselves to account. I believe, I certainly do. And, the industry is now being asked to hold itself to account. And we make up the industry. So absolutely, I couldn't agree with that statement anymore. We do need to take responsibility. We do need to hold ourselves to account, and equally we have to hold others to account as well, where we have to. So yeah, I like the spirit and the energy behind that question, and I would agree. Yeah, we do, and I think that's what we're trying to do now.
And Yusuf, can I come to you as a manufacturer? How would you kind of respond to Lucy's point?
I think it's critical. As much as I think it's important, we all kind of share information and we have a sense of what everyone else around us is doing to gauge what normal is. I also think we need to be very careful that our own situation is unique. Now, take Plumis, for example, the way in which we operate is our products operate is different from your more conventional system. So where there's that difference, we've had to almost double down on the evidence and the information that we share to try and explain and communicate that. So, I think it starts with a really wide search and a look across the industry to try and pick out the best practice, but then tailoring it back to your own situation, your own product, and then trying to communicate that back. So it's very much a conversation, listening, reacting, back and forth.
And Steph?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're not here to do the right thing, then we might as well pack up and go home, hadn't we? I mean, that is absolutely what we all need to be doing. And I certainly wouldn't want to be working with anybody on my team or across the sector that isn't here to do the right thing. I think the challenge is, what is the right thing? And that's the difficulty that I think a lot of people face, isn't it? So they might think they're doing the right thing, but what does that look like? I mean, I think we all share the same aim, but I think the reality in a lot of organisations is you have to look at that competence level, don't you? And now we're seeing it's not just about training, it is about that integrity, isn't it? It's about making sure that you have got that right skill set, the right character of person. It isn't just a tick box exercise. And I mean, just going back to smoke detection, you might have something in there that, yes, you've got smoke detection there, but if you're not testing it, you've ticked a box to say you're compliant, but is it safe? Well, no, potentially not. So I think, yeah, we absolutely need to do the right thing, but I think people are confused about what that looks like, and there are some challenges. I mean, people are going to come up against budgetary constraints. They're going to come up against perhaps senior leaders that maybe don't understand the full extent of the implications of some of this regulation, and there's still confusion among experts about what some of this means. So I think it is really important that we have these conversations, but I think everybody should be there wanting to do the right thing. Absolutely.
Okay, I'm now being inundated with questions and comments, so there's a couple of specifics which I'll ask the two practitioners on the panel first. So Chris Waterman again, I saw some closers fitted to the outside of front doors so that they could be checked. Is this okay? Steph?
Yes, technically it is okay. It can be done. However, I think you're going to want to think carefully about whether that's applicable and appropriate in a particular block. So, for example, if you've got a high prevalence of antisocial behaviour in a particular block, it would be very easy for somebody to tamper with those door closers, wouldn't it? So I don't like them for that reason. But on the other hand, you can then check them, can't you, more easily? But I think to carry out a proper fire door check, you still need to open it anyway. So you know, I'm not sure you really get over the issue of ensuring that everything is quite as it should be just by putting the door closer on the outside.
Okay, but I won't ask you the same question because I suspect you're going to say the same thing as Stephanie said. But there's another question from Stephen Shiner. Can I ask about the person-centered fire risk assessment? Is this required in a hostel type property? Kabbe.
Is a person-centered fire risk assessment required in a hostel type property? Yes, potentially, depending on who lives in the hostel. Yeah, sorry, caught me unawares there.
No, it's okay. It's a specific question.
Yeah,
that's fine. Okay,
absolutely. But
Stephen,
just to go back to that point about the door close on the outside. So yes, it can be done. In some cases, it should be done for ease of access. However, maybe it shouldn't be done on things like open balconies where the door closer is now exposed to the elements, because that's going to have a material effect on the life cycle and the effectiveness of that door closer. So just having a blanket approach with all our door closers on the outside of all of our buildings, I think maybe that might be something that needs to be looked at, because you're going to cause other problems by doing that in certain buildings. That was all.
Absolutely, and I think just coming back to Stephanie's point, because a question's come in about lithium-ion batteries, and it just occurred to me that if we're trying to get people to test their smoke alarms or make sure they're working, trying to get people to remember not to charge their battery or their scooter in their front hall when they go to sleep, I think is a bigger danger, isn't it? So how on earth do we do that, Stephanie?
Oh, well, this is on our risk register, actually. It's one of our biggest, I think, emerging risks as a sector. I know, I mean, if you look, there are a number of organisations that have already banned them. I mean, how you practically police that is another matter, isn't it? But it's a huge risk. I mean, we've provided a lot of information to residents about them. But, I mean, we've got a huge second-hand market now because they've been around for a while. So you've got people with scooters and second-hand bikes and things like that. There's no regulation in terms of where the chargers or the batteries have come from. I think that's probably what needs to drive the change, is some kind of regulation on these products. But in the meantime, the market's just been flooded with thousands of potentially unsafe products. It's an area that I think is at the NHMF we're going to be looking at in terms of best practice. I don't have the answer to it today, unfortunately. I'd love to ban them, but as I say, the practical implications of that just make it impossible, don't they? Because who's going to police that? And I think we've got enough problems with mobility scooters that we know about, let alone things that have gone, into people's homes. And also, it is to a certain extent, it's up to people what they do, isn't it? How do you police what they buy, and if they're storing it behind their own front door in their own home? I think our role at the moment needs to be about highlighting the risks, putting out that best practice about charging, looking at their batteries, making sure they're not damaged, buying from reputable sources. But it's an emerging risk, undoubtedly.
Kabbe, and then I'll come to you, Yusuf, about from the suppression perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this kind of speaks to the point that Yusuf was making earlier about innovation again, because this is a massively emerging risk, and it's only going to get worse, as Stephanie's just highlighted. And I think the use of innovation and technology to mitigate against new technology, it makes absolute sense. To me, as an engineer. I think also, Yusuf, there might be the possibility of some research around this particular topic that we can talk about somewhat separately. But battery fires, and it's not just lithium-ion batteries. We have known fire causations in this country from your average AAA, AA type battery, disposed in bin hoppers and things like that. So it's not just lithium ion. Don't want to demonize lithium ion batteries. We have to dispose of all of our batteries appropriately. Lithium ion batteries are the batteries that drive all of our technological advancements, from smartwatches to electric cars. Without lithium ion batteries, we can't do all of that stuff. So the risk has emerged and is present and real. And my feeling is that we have to innovate. We have to do more than the minimum, because the minimum doesn't account for any of these new risks. Going back to our earlier conversation, Jan, Stephanie, and Yusuf. So yeah, there's again a lot to consider, and I think research certainly in this regard might help. But certainly engagement, education, and information to residents about the risks to them and their households. Yeah, that's up to us to do that at the moment, and define what best practice in that regard looks like.
Before I go to Yusuf, can I just remind people that I put up on LinkedIn the photograph of that baby monitor that had been left charging on somebody's bed when the family went out shopping. When they came back, the house was on fire because the blooming baby monitor had burst into flames. Now, if you can't trust a baby monitor, we're all doomed, quite frankly. But anyway, but the answer, of course, is not to leave things charging on soft furnishings. Yusuf.
When I think about this problem, I think about the challenge where you have the way in which people use their homes being at odds with the fire safety guidance or the advice that we have to protect them. So, you know, something as simple as a door closer can be ineffective in an area that is commonly a thoroughfare where people are going back and forth all the time because naturally they just want to prop it open. So I think this is the huge challenge with lithium-ion batteries, because, you know, they do hold a great deal of charge. They're an excellent, you know, they're more efficient than other batteries, so people are going to want to use them. So how do we innovate to reduce that risk? I think technology can come in certain instances. Resident engagement can come in to kind of communicate that risk. I'm sure there'll be innovation in fire safety campaigns to try and communicate those things. I think you need to kind of address all of these aspects to try and get to a place where we can mitigate and reduce it. But there isn't a quick answer or an easy one. I think it's multifaceted and it's going to evolve over time.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy Mallets from Shellens come up and asked, could residents keep their scooters in a fire protected store or similar as part of the tenancy agreement? A simple question that we could probably spend an entire 60 minutes on, I suspect, Jeremy, but if I go to Stephanie first.
I think there is a real issue actually with us sort of almost being seen as the bad guys that are going in and saying, right, don't do this and don't do that and you can't do this. And I think it extends beyond you know, compliance. It's things like now we're talking about you know, damp and mold, aren't we? So, you know, don't dry your clothes indoors and don't do this and don't store this here. And the only way really you're going to change that behaviour is by giving people another option. So it's unrealistic, isn't it, to expect that people are going to change their behaviour unless they have got an alternative. And one of those alternatives may well be a storage facility or a solution. There are, of course, some practical challenges with that. A number of blocks won't have that in there. You've then got safety and security issues. You've then potentially got a whole heap of you know, combustible or risk products, you know, stored in one place as well. So I think, yeah, that's absolutely one potential solution. But I think we already face that, don't they? We sort of, you know, push chairs and children's bikes and tools and any equipment that people generally do leave in common parts because they have got nowhere to store it. And I think that's almost something we need to factor into our design going forward as well, to think the way that we live in our homes now is very different to the way we lived 50 years ago when some of these blocks were put together. We've got more stuff now and we need to do something with it. So yeah, I think storage is one possible solution, absolutely, but it will depend on the challenges of each individual block and scenario.
It's interesting. Before I go to Kabbe, I'll just, given I'm older than the rest of you by about 100 years, I would remind you that in fact when we were building blocks of flats in the late 60s and 70s, we actually built things called pram sheds, because in those days we had things called prams, which were quite large bits of kit which you couldn't take into your flat, and the designers actually created pram sheds for them to put the prams in. Obviously over a period of time, they've become sources, they've become spots of antisocial behaviour, blah 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 blah. But somebody said the other day that housing is a concentric circle. You start at one end and you come round, and 50 years later you're back again. But Kabbe, just continue the conversation.
Yeah, so pram sheds are a known risk also, quite a significant risk in some boroughs, given the content, which is unknown. But we'll leave that there. I think Stephanie's right again. We can't keep imposing our will on residents, so-called customers, in their homes. We have to acknowledge that the home in 2023 is very different to the home in 1950. And until we do that, we're just going to keep designing and preparing for things that have already been superseded or passed us by. I think we've got to get ahead of this myself, and I really do think we have to consult more broadly with the residents. I do think that we have to, bring them into the conversation as expected by the strategies, the resident engagement strategies, and try and take them with us on this particular journey that we're all on. And we don't even know where this journey is going to end at the moment. And as much as some of us might have some, some knowledge, some of it specialist, some of it generalist, some of it practical, it's different now. The fire safety, the resident safety landscape is different for me. I suspect it's different for large parts of our organizations and industries as well, which is why we're here. I'm only employed at RBKC because something occurred back in 2017. There are many other fire safety teams across the country that have only just been created because something occurred in 2017. All of this new statute that we're all trying to get ready for but don't really understand yet, well, it's here because something occurred. So we have to be different. I think we have to engage with our young people, our old people especially, much differently when it comes to fire. We need to plug in some of that education and information in the early years settings, and start normalizing resident safety, building safety, fire safety. We can't just have one person going into a school once every 2 years to give a 20-minute presentation. I think we have to go back to basics with that and actually start plugging that information there. In terms of our older people, for want of a better word, again, they need information. They need education. I was looking directly at you when I said that, yeah. But they need information and they need education too, as we all need education and we all need information. So it's that sharing piece again for me, that partnership working piece again. Absolutely. But storage is one way of doing it. But where do you find the storage in an existing building that's already full of everything that it can be full of, which is why everybody's storing stuff in the common parts,
Okay, listen, let's park that. I've got Luke coming up with a specific question. Just wondered whether either of you two represent with your landlords. Have you got any listed buildings as part of your portfolio? Because Luke says, how do you get around door replacements in listed buildings? A specialist question, but Kabbe, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, we have the world famous Trellick Tower in our borough. Wonderful feat of architecture and engineering and construction. But changing the fire doors in it is difficult. But they have to be changed because they're very, very old. Very, very old. And in some cases, they've been repaired to the point where we can't repair them anymore. We have to replace them. So we're engaging with, not English Heritage, I forget the other one. Not the Conservation Society, I forget the other one. But we're engaging and we're trying to make the case for safety for that building. So we don't only have to make the case for safety to the regulator, we have to make the case to safety to many other stakeholders. And we're currently in that process where we're meeting with them and just trying to explain to them what all of this new statute means in the context of all of these wonderful listed buildings. We don't want the building to disappear, but we absolutely don't want anybody in the building to get hurt either. So there's a real balance to be struck when dealing with listed buildings and heritage properties. In that, as a fire engineer, for example, my priority normally is life safety. The building is secondary. We can deal with that via other channels, but we can't deal with harming people easily ever. So it's challenging again. That much I can say.
I'll come back to Yusuf. I'll come to you in a minute because I know Plumis have been involved in heritage buildings. But Steph, have you got any listed buildings or heritage buildings?
We've got several because we're sort of down in Dorset, so we've got some lovely old buildings that do prove a real challenge when it comes to upgrading for any purpose actually, but particularly for fire safety. So similar, it's really engaging with the local authority, and in my experience, each not even just each area, but each officer has a slightly different view on what is and isn't acceptable, which is often a real challenge in itself. So I think my advice would be the earlier you engage with them, the better. And if you go to them and present the issue, you know, we need to do this because then you can kind of jointly come up with a solution. And there are a number of options. I mean, in certain circumstances, we have had to have bespoke fire doors made to replicate, you know, ancient kind of panel doors, and then they want them stained in a particular colour. And, you know, if you can reuse any of the ironmongery and things like that, and, you know, trying to explain, well, actually, that's not really quite achievable, but there is usually a way around it, but that does come at a cost.
And indeed, and of course there may be an occasion for mitigation rather than the replacement. And Yusuf, do you want to talk about how Plumis have been involved in heritage buildings?
Yeah, we've done quite a few different heritage buildings over our the lifetime of the company. You know, notably, I can think of William Goodrich Freedom House in America, which is both a heritage building. It's a national treasure, arguably, and we've done quite a few similar buildings. But you know, each one is unique and provides its own sort of challenges, and just sometimes you know, a unique approach can kind of offer that solution. But again, it's very much a case-by-case basis.
Yeah. On that note, sorry, Yusuf, could we talk separately about a pilot maybe at Trellick, even if it's one void premises, because if I can show the residents of that particular building what it is that they're, you know, seemingly, you know, continuing to object to, it might help. It might facilitate the conversation, because at the moment all they're hearing is sprinkler, trunking. That's not necessarily where we're going to go with this particular project. So we'll talk about that separately.
I'll leave you two separately, but I'll just say to people who watch the BBC series Ghosts that when you're watching the programme, if you look very carefully behind the ghost, you actually see the Plumis spray heads in all of the rooms, because Plumis put the kit in for the entire building. I just mentioned that in passing.
Wonderful.
I just made that in passing. Okay, so I've got some more questions. Tina Mystery. What needs to change to get a people-centric approach to delivery? What needs to change to get a people-centric approach to delivery? Stephanie.
Interesting question.
Just.
Yeah, not quite sure how to take that actually. I mean, I'm assuming you mean people-centric in terms of the end customer as a result of that. That's how I'm kind of reading it. Well, and I think it's all those things that we talked about, isn't it? So it's assessing those needs in the first place. It's making sure you've got the right people that are going to deliver that, and it is that early engagement with all parties to ensure you've got the right outcome. And I mean, it comes down to people. You know, we need to be the right people. We need to employ the right people, and we need to be engaging with the right people.
Absolutely. Listen, I've got to just move swiftly, KB, a swift response, because we're coming close to the end of it. How come we've spent an hour on this already? For goodness sake, it's
easily done. It's easily done. I'm going to sidestep this question because Tina Mystery is soon to be a valued member of my team. So I understand the genesis of the question. And I'm not going to allow her to try and trip me up publicly.
Okay. All right.
Great question, but yeah.
Yusuf, you can join in on this.
Yeah, well, you know, funnily enough, my role before Plumis, I worked as a person-centered designer for the Helen Hamlin Design and Research Center. And what we would do is we get employed by organizations like Samsung and BlackBerry to solve a specific problem for a person. And we'd have to spend a lot of time trying to get to know the customers that we were serving, the stakeholders, the context, and then try and come up with solutions specifically for them. And that didn't always mean listening to everything that they said. It was trying to take a balanced view and give an outcome. And what I think about this, you know, I think part of the reason we've got Magna and we've got RBKC on this call is because they're looking forward and they're trying to come up with solutions. They're trying to think differently. And I just keep thinking that a lot of the fire safety interventions that we have, once upon a time, it was a individual organization who was saying, oh, I'm going to just try this because I think this meets my it fits with the problem that I'm trying to solve. And then slowly but surely it becomes common practice, it gets written into guidance and it's everywhere. But there is a journey from looking to solve a problem for a small amount of people that can be scaled and reach a wider audience.
Right, listen, I need to stop us because we've hit the magic hour. I need to say to those people whose questions we've not answered, we'll get back to you separately. Stephen Schneider about caravans, perhaps you and I can have a conversation separately as well. We will touch the other answers as well separately. I'll discuss with panel members. But for the purposes of this session, Stephanie, Kabbe, and Yusuf, I'd like to thank you for your joining in. I hope people found the conversation useful. The next Plumis webinar is going to be talking about the Regulation 28 reports that come out from coroners, which have followed on from the Rule 43 letter, the 43 reports that started off the Lakanal House story. For the moment, though, panel members, thank you so much for your time. And for the purposes of this session this morning, I bid you all a very good morning and thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for listening.
Everyone.
Thanks. Speak to you all soon. Take care.
Bye.